officially around 300 people that were killed. But again, that's a rough estimate because many bodies were not found. They think they were just incinerated. And there's actually more reports of that in Peshtigo, of just incineration, like people running and just poof. And there's one haunting picture up there of what used to be a train, and all that's left are the iron wheels. Everything else is just completely gone. It was like a hurricane. I hate to say the word hurricane after what we just seen from down in Florida and elsewhere, but it was a hurricane of fire without the winds being 100 miles an hour. It seemed like it. Everybody swore the winds seemed to be much faster, but the official word was around 30 miles an hour, and just extremely hot. The issue wasn't so much smoke. It was just the heat and the gas of the air that was difficult to breathe and was just like in the air itself.
Hey, John, while I'm thinking about it, have you ever heard anything about where Mary Todd Lincoln was during the fire?
Yes. Yeah, she actually was at with Robert Todd where he was living at. And I actually have the address if you want it.
Was that when he was up on about like Division?
No. They actually had to flee for their lives, and another part of her horrific ordeal. I have it right here in front of me. 653 Wabash.
Okay, yeah. That might be the Great Northern Hotel. I'd have to double check a little bit. You have to do the you have to check like the renumbering and everything. Everything got renumbered and things got renumbered in 1909. So.
Yeah, her husband was shot in Ford's Theater, and then she lost Willie in the White House, and then just before the fire, she lost another son, Tad, died in July of that year of 1871. So she lost her husband, 2 kids, and then she's with her son Robert Todd.
Another one before.
Yes. Then they had to flee for her life. She always dressed in black and was part of the, just helped devastate her condition. And of course, then shortly thereafter, Robert Todd had to have her committed in the Bellevue home, which I drive by very often. It's on Route 31 in Batavia.
Yeah,
still there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
there's some interesting reports from her sanity trial, and she was absolutely railroaded, but I don't think anybody would have voted to acquit.
She was only there for a few months, I do believe. It was 1875 was the year. Yeah.
Right. The trial was here in Chicago.
Right, and she never forgave her son for that, I do believe.
No, she was. It's hard to diagnose somebody from 150 years later, but I often feel like if she had get like some Zoloft and Excedrin migraine, she would have been a whole new woman.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So let's see. And we talked about architecture earlier. Some of the ones that still stood afterwards were Chicago Water Tower, Chicago Avenue Pumping Station, St. Michael's Church, and St. Ignatius College Prep. The church, weren't they a lot of the parishioners of the church believers that there was some divine intervention there? Aren't there some stories associated with that?
You know about that?
Probably. I know there's a story that goes around saying that Father Damon told everybody to pray for the church, and then the church was spared. Mm-hmm. But the church wasn't really in the path of the fire, and Father Damon was in New York at the time. He sent a telegram, but not with those kind of instructions to it. So it's a little bit of an urban legend, but you can see how these things grow. I mean, the church was fairly close to the fire zone.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one church. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, all I heard is that the fire had kind of like done something weird and gone around the church, and that was the thing that where they said it was a miracle.
They like to say.
I realized the source.
Right. That's a little bit of an exaggeration.
Mm-hmm.
Say they went right around.
Well, they did. There was strange stories of that. It was like I said earlier. You weren't online, Adam. That it spared Malin Ogden's home, which is now the Newberry Library on that spot, and that was made out of wood. And they did a lot of things to protect it, but it was amazing. Some houses were spared. The only municipal building in Chicago that was spared was the water tower. Waterworks was actually damaged and stopped the water flow in that building. So the municipal building, water tower, was the only one.
Yeah, the old city hall and jail was in good enough shape that they were able to keep using it for a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not in great shape, but good enough that they could keep using it for a while.
Yeah, some of the structures remain, but I mean, it was gutted. Many of the buildings inside were in so terrible condition.
Right.
I was actually going to bring this up earlier. I meant to talk about this. Catherine O'Leary's barn. Isn't there like a training station for firemen there now? Something like that.
Yes,
you guys would know better.
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is the fire training academy is right about on the same airspace where Mrs. O'Leary's cottage barn would have been.
That's courtesy of Mayor Daley, the father. He did that, and right on the. They've changed some names of the addresses. It's no longer 137 to Coven.
Right.
But that's right there. We stopped in there before. The firemen are always real nice in there, and there's a little bit of history on the walls there, and that's the spot right there, Fire Academy. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Any other interesting facts you guys want to throw out about it that I have not gotten into yet?
I know. Well, speaking of that training academy, I can tell you one of the famous Chicago ghost stories is that in I want to say it was 1919. There was a fire at Curran Hall, and that morning a police officer named Frank Levy had been standing there with his hand against the window, acting all spooky and saying, "Today something's going to happen today. This is going to be my last day in the fire department." And everyone said, knock it off, Frank. But then that night came, several firefighters, including Frank Levy, were killed. And the next morning, his handprint was still there. And supposedly they could never get rid of the handprint. It ties into a lot of like urban legend motifs about like the handprint or the bloodstain that could never be washed off. There's one photograph of the handprint that I've seen from several years later, which makes it look like they had kind of actually varnished it, not tried to get rid of it or anything. But in that fire training academy, they've got Frank Levy's badge up on the wall. They've got a badge of all of the firefighters who were ever killed in the line of duty. In most cases, original. Sometimes they had to have a replica made, but one of them is Francis Levy's. And notably among all of them is nobody from 1871. Apparently no firefighters were killed during the Great Chicago Fire.
Well, yeah. Well, there's another interesting story. I love stories about time travel. Of course, it's just interesting fiction. But I've read thoroughly Mrs. O'Leary's testimony, other people's testimony of the fire, and she said, besides going to bed early that night and so forth, she said, before I went to bed, she noticed a strange man like in the outside, and then there's nothing more questioned about it. And I'm thinking, who is this strange man? It wasn't Pegleg O'Sullivan. And you always wonder, if you ever could go back in time of the places you'd want to be. I'd like to go see who started the fire.
Yeah.
And, maybe who
see what it was. Yeah.
Guy?
Yeah. This is what I always say when I'm running boat tours is, without a time machine, we'll never know. Did the green hay spontaneously combust? Was it a lightning strike? One of the boat tour companies, they make all their guides say that we now know for sure that it was a lightning strike. Like, Did you build a time machine or what?
Well, like my grandmother was on the Eastland in 1915 and survived. 844 people died, and the only thing I know about how she survived is some strange man, while she was on it before it capsized, told her, she's 20 years old at the time, and told her, I think it'd be safer for you if you stood over here instead of over here. And, back then, it's just a matter of where you were standing, where you were, if you were lived or died. And she lived. And who was the strange man that told her to move over there? Maybe it was me, but I didn't go back in time yet. But,
Yeah, you think there was a police box nearby?
I don't know. I'm glad she listened to him, and she moved, or I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you know, we talk about mysteries a lot on the show. Like we talked about the Starved Rock murders. I mean, we're talking Illinois, you know, and while there may not be a lot of mystery to that, still people talk about it to this day. I mean, and I realize this is maybe a little hard for you guys because you're Chicago guys or Illinois guys, but I mean, Great Chicago Fire, the cause of it. I mean, when we talk about some of our nation's mysteries, I mean, where do you put this? Obviously, it's behind JFK and a lot of the other big ones. But, I mean, do you think this is like a big story nationwide that people still wonder about, or do you think it's kind of been forgotten in history? I know people know the name.
Most people just think it was Mrs. O'Leary and the cow.
Yeah.
Right.
That there's any doubt to that, you have to dig a little deeper to find out about.
Mm-hmm.
But that was fake news.
Yeah, it's people just like the Custer and the little bighorn. We don't know what happened because everybody was wiped out there in 1876, and it's another big mystery. But the myth continues. You know, there's that song "Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight," and there's a second verse in there where it perpetuates the myth of Mrs. O'Leary's cow, and the second verse, which I know. I try not to do, but I could do it if you want.
Go ahead. You can do it.
All right. One dark night when we were all in bed, Mrs. O'Leary left the lantern in the shed, and when the cow kicked it down, she winked her eye and said, "There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight."
And Mrs. O'Leary, she is the ultimate scapegoat, is she not? I mean, you talked about it earlier, but I mean, it took till 1997 for her to be ultimately exonerated of the whole thing?
Yes. Well, not only that, there's another scapegoat in the Eastland disaster, since I have a connection to it, and that would be Joseph Erickson, who was the chief engineer. And he actually was a hero. That he was the engineer, and he turned the engines off so they wouldn't explode. His water was up to his neck. The thing was capsized. In fact, he was a small, skinny guy. He swam out through the porthole and went right back down, was rescuing people. Well, they all blamed it on him, and the poor guy had to hire a lawyer. Matter of fact, he hired Clarence Darrow. He couldn't afford it, but he did, and he just devastated his life. And he died a couple years later of a broken heart. He looked like a 70-year-old man. He was only about 34 years old when he died.
I couldn't believe Mrs. O'Leary actually stayed in Chicago. I know she stayed out of the public eye, but I mean to actually stay in the area.
No photograph. There's no photograph of her, no drawing made from life. I believe that's been said that was her revenge on reporters.
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. Absolutely. We do have a drawing of Big Jim. I never saw a photograph of Big Jim, but I saw a sketch of him before, but not of Mrs. O'Leary.
Yes, did you talk about his story? Did we talk about his story about the green hay?
No, I didn't get into Big Jim.
All right, Big Jim O'Leary. Around the time the first story went around, it's one of my favorite little bits is the story about the two kids who broke in to steal milk from the cow to make whiskey punch and dropped a pipe into the hay or something. When they told the story, part of the angle was they confessed it to their priest immediately, and he absolved them for the horrible mistake, but did give them a stern lecture about trying to become whiskey drinkers. So burning down the city, that's just it's just all part of growing up. But you put this whiskey drinking thing. But when that story went around, a reporter went into one of Big Jim's gambling places, and he said, "Now listen, that story about the lamp is the monumental fake of the century." He said that what really happened is they had just gotten a load of green hay into the hayloft, and the hay spontaneously combusted.
Yes,
which is something the green hay is known to do.
Yeah. Big
Jim
is always
spontaneous combustion story, but not about the green hay. So I didn't realize that.
Yep.
There's only two things about Big Jim about that story. Number one, the good part is, I mean, he was there. He was a kid, and he actually was there. The downside is he was a noted gambler and a very notorious character. So whether we believe him or not, there you have it, right?
Right. Yeah. Once again, we need a time machine to find out for sure. And really, what we're talking about is not really what started the Great Chicago Fire, is what started what should have been a regular old barn fire. Kind of thing that happened just about every day. It was just like the perfect storm of events that made it spread further. Might have just been an accident waiting to happen, really.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, they were having two fires every day, like they had talked about. So it apparently was just bound to happen. I mean, plus, you know, it was a fire hazard. The entire city was a fire hazard, as we talked about, you know.
Well, there were 50 miles worth of wooden sidewalks and even streets. Many of them were on wood blocks. And the Achilles heel was, even though these buildings were considered fireproof, of brick and so forth, the roofs were wood and tar.